Hello and welcome to my YouTube channel. My name is Melvin Way. This is a plant growing series on growing Miracle papaya trees from seeds. Day 0. It's 2020 July 7th. So it's in the middle of summer. I'm going to bisect this with my knife and scoop out the seeds inside in the hollow cavity. This is the most straightforward case of seed extraction for any fruit out there. So there are hundreds of seeds inside. This fruit, the Miracle variety, has sort of a cantaloupe taste to it. It's a lot more palatable to me than the pukey taste that I typically got from papayas in the past. So as you can probably tell, papaya is not my favorite fruit. But there has been a lot of interest in growing papaya, so that's why I'm trying to grow a papaya tree. And I'm very interested to see what the process is and how the development goes. So they have this slippery, slimy seed coat that must be removed with paper towels. I'm just going to squeeze that stuff off there, rub it between my gloved fingers and the paper towel, and that should strip most of the slimy seed coat off, although it's very juicy, so one paper towel won't be enough for your efforts. So I'm going to strip off that slimy seed coat and then gather them all back into a new paper towel like I'm showing you here and give it another rub off. So that should be good enough. In series past I used to pay more attention to sterility and things like that. You can certainly rinse them off in a cup of water if you want to, or even hydrogen peroxide, but I think as long as you got the seed coat off and most of the juices off, it should do pretty well. So do a second round of scrubbing, and here are the seeds with and without the seed coats. So without the seed coats, there's just no shininess to them. They look like burrs, but they're not spiky. So this is the preparation work that I did well in advance of day 0 of this series. So I bought a lot of these Rubbermaid trash cans. First thing to do is peel off the stickers so it doesn't get all wet and soggy and grow mold later, because I'm going to stack one trash can inside the other, and the easiest way to remove these is just to apply some heat to get them off relatively easily, and if there's any residue you can use the sticker itself to dab it off. The next order of business is to use a power drill to drill small drainage holes in the bottoms of these waste baskets that I'm going to stack on top of each other. This will be the inner waste basket. The outer waste basket will have larger holes and fewer of them. So now I'm giving you a demo of how I collected clay soil from the hills nearby in San Diego, California. So I use a colander to filter out all the pebbles. There's actually more pebbles in here than there is clay soil, and the clay soil itself is not completely pure. It has things like sand and silt in it, and it also has a tiny bit of organic matter. But the main purpose of this entire exercise is to produce a growing medium that's very permeable to oxygen and water, and also something that has next to nothing in terms of organic matter inside it. So you should always wear a mask when you're handling dry clay soil, because as you saw when I poured it, it's very fine and goes airborne very easily. And if you keep working with stuff like that, you'll end up with clay in your phlegm basically afterwards. So I'm mixing together 7 volumes of sand per 1 volume of filtered clay soil for the equivalent of 90+% sand, sandy loam. So sandy loam is used to describe naturally occurring soils that are very high in sand content, and this is something that was preferred by farmers in the past. It's said to be the general all-purpose growing medium for all sorts of plants. If you don't know the exact conditions that the species favors, always go with sandy loam and don't have all these organic materials inside your growing medium, because not all plants, in fact most plants, will just experience root rot from that. So that's why I'm using this inorganic medium. So don't forget to saturate the sand and soil mixture with water to settle it and compact it before using it, because it's going to lose quite a bit of volume. So back to day 0. of this series, I planted 5 of these Miracle papaya seeds. And pardon the poor angle of the videography here because you can't really see what's going on, but basically I dug small fingertip holes with my index finger up to the first joint, and then I planted the seeds, 1 in the center and 4 at rectangular points away from the center. So this is something I've done for recent growing series, such as for the lemon series and so on, and the jackfruit series, because I've had such a high success rate with this method of indoor germination that I don't do that many replicates. But people have said that growing papaya can be challenging, germinating it and growing it in the early seedling stages. So who knows, maybe this won't turn out to be easy, and maybe I'm vastly underplanting, undersowing. So I'm just going to give it a loose pat down here and spray it with 3% hydrogen peroxide to disinfect the top layer. And hydrogen peroxide is a relatively harmless compound unless it's in a very high concentration. It's used to disinfect wounds and contact lenses and things like that. So what it is it's a free radical that can break down into molecular oxygen and water. So it's very pure that way, and what this will do here is hopefully kill the microbes on the top and provide extra oxygen for the germinating seeds developing root systems, because roots only use oxygen. They don't need carbon dioxide like the leaves do for photosynthesis. So I'm just going to wrap this up with plastic wrap because San Diego is a pretty dry place, and something that's 90+% sand will dry out very quickly, at least on the top layer. It's actually great for holding moisture in such a big volume, but the top layer will dry out. And since that's where my seeds are, I don't want that to happen. So who knows how many days this is going to take, but usually for a lot of plants, it takes like a few weeks for germination. So 40 days later, I saw nothing, so I kind of let this dry out a little bit on the top, although you can see there's still a little bit of wetness and moisture due to the coloration. So this is when I started my jackfruit series, 40 days into the Miracle papaya seed sowing timeline. So I planted the jackfruit seeds in the same positions, but since they're so big, they probably shifted around the positions of the papaya seeds. So once again, I'm spraying 3% hydrogen peroxide, but this time for the jackfruit seeds, because I thought the papaya seeds were goners. Nothing had happened after 40 days, so why not just use the pot for a different series? And the reason I do indoor germination is because that way I can ensure that the nighttime temperatures are as high as the daytime temperatures. San Diego, California has a very desert-like climate once you go more than a few miles inland. So the night times can be very cold compared to the daytime highs. And hence, if you lose, say, 20 or 30 degrees Fahrenheit or more between the day's highs and the day's lows, then you can get a much slower germination. So on day 43, I saw that something popped up within this pot, and the soil's bursting open like that, the sand. So I was very excited. I thought this was a jackfruit seedling, and part of it was because it's sizable, but at the same time I expected something bigger, and there's a tinier sprout to the left of it, so I don't know what that is. Maybe that's just a weed. It looks awfully small, even though the beginning of its development makes it look exactly the same. So that's a problem with weeds just occurring naturally in the soil, and since I took filtered clay soil, you never know what you're going to get. But that looks like a common weed, the small one. The larger one is definitely not anything weed-like. It looks very agricultural in its origin. It just looks like the beginning of a honeydew seed, to be honest. So 3 days later, it's doing pretty well. It's sort of like a honeydew seed in that it doesn't stand up very straight either. So a byproduct of growing things indoors in these artificial environments is you don't have the sun rotating overhead in its trajectory throughout the day, so any kind of light coming from one source can make the plant just swing to one direction via phototropism. So I'm going to spray some distilled water. I'm going to go easy on the hydrogen peroxide, but you notice this top layer of sand is continuously drying out even if it's sealed with plastic wrap. That's because it's not an airtight seal. And whenever I spray extra stuff like that, the drainage holes will leak a little bit of it on the bottom, so that's okay. It'll never be waterlogged. So on day 47, it reached the point where I had to make a choice as to whether I was going to move this pot outside or not, just for this one seedling. But what if it's a weed? Then I'm moving my pot outdoors for nothing. And then my jackfruit seedling germination will be delayed because the nights will be cold. So I know it's it was probably like late August by this point. My trusty old Lux meter shows that this receives the same amount of light on the balcony, just passive, indirect sunlight, compared to having the LED panels on indoors all day. So that's a very easy choice to make, and to save on electricity, it's a very simple choice. But I'm still taking the gamble that this is actually what I think it is. So at this point it's not really that clear because I looked up a lot of different pictures online, and I had sowed a lot of black mission fig seeds in the other pot, but I wasn't sure if I had sown them in this pot as well. So I had some questions in my mind as to what species this was because it's developing so slowly. And it's really just yet another structuralist plant. It really reminds me of the honeydew seedlings I first started growing in 2013, 7 years ago, when I started all of this plant growing series business. So I'm going to prop this up with some extra sand, and as you can see, it's late August, entering early September, so I did start getting some direct sunlight on my balcony, and direct sunlight is anywhere from 20,000 to 120,000 lux. Compare that to 2,000 from the LED panel. And after a 7-day hiatus, I was gone for quite a while, I came back to this, so that's very evidently a jackfruit, and the first seedling actually damped off. Damping off is caused by fungus and fungi-like microorganism infections in the roots, so that just shrivels up from the root system. That's why it couldn't stand up on its own, even though it looked very healthy from the shoot up. So that too is very similar to what happened with my honeydew seedlings growing in potting mix 7 years ago. So I'm going to flood water. That's the most efficient way to keep everything moist, especially now that it's outdoors. I can't keep everything wrapped up in plastic forever. The jackfruit seedling is going to bust right through that, and it's going to grow all crooked and gnarly if I don't remove the plastic. So this, what I think it is, a papaya seedling in the middle, it should take off, although you can see it's again not displaying very much structure there. It's sort of fallen over just by this watering alone. So that doesn't bode well for the future, and I already lost my first one. My impression is that papaya seeds are very prone to damping off the seedlings' root systems in the very beginning. So despite what I thought were foolproof conditions indoors, I already lost one seedling. And that hasn't happened for all of my other recent plant series, so this is probably a tough customer compared to many other things in terms of germinating it and getting it to grow. So on day 63, I wasn't sure whether it was a papaya or black mission fig. If you look up the seedling pictures out there, you'll get all these different pictures. Most of them are pretty crappy. So I did finally find one picture that sort of suggests that this is a papaya seedling. On day 68, you can see this thing is standing up pretty well on its own. That's a good sign. I guess it's gotten past that phase at which damping off is a risk. And being outdoors is probably better for these seedlings. So because of all the uncertainty in what I had, I bought a Caribbean red papaya as a backup. And 2 days later, the whole thing started rotting away. It was molding over. And after 6 days, it was fermenting, So this thing is just pretty much a knife-free operation because it's so soft and rotten. And of course I'm not going to eat it because it's so far gone. You can't just go by what's on the surface. Fungi have these mycelia that go pretty deep into whatever substrate they're eating. So you might think, yeah, it looks fine in there. You know, it's just a little bit of alcohol smell. But actually the whole thing is rotting away. It's probably rotten all the way to the core already and very dangerous to eat. So that was a loss in terms of eating, but here's an example of what the seeds look like at 2x magnification up close. So they're very pitted and rough in the surface. And in retrospect, maybe it was a mistake to use moldy fruit seeds like this because maybe the fungi, the spores, and the fungal cells are all over these things already. But, you know, since I wasn't going to eat the fruit, I decided to just go with it in terms of planting the seeds. So I am potentially planting a lot of fungi or fungi-like organisms into here that could be very dangerous for the papaya seedlings. So in this case, I decided to keep almost all of the seeds on the surface to get a window into how these things, when they germinate, how fast, etc. And I just wanted to keep things visible. And I decided if they all germinate, I'll plant them deeper. If nothing happens within, say, 2 or 3 weeks, then I can just scoop it all through a filter such as a colander and just get rid of all of those seeds. So on day 74, another seedling of the same species popped up. So that's a promising development, although it casts further doubt as to you know, whether these are actually papaya seeds, because I remember I only planted 5 seeds, so how would one of those end up over there? So I did do a transplant because I didn't want this thing to get overshadowed very quickly by all the jackfruit seedlings. You can see how the base of the stem is pink. I'm pretty sure this is a papaya, but I think at the time I planted this, I kept telling myself it was a black mission fig. So I'm digging a hole in there as deep for the root system as I can provide. This sort of transplant is actually pretty easy. This thing isn't that fragile, so it's a good sign. And there were no signs of root rot. The root system looked very, very healthy. The root system is longer than the shoot system, which is normal and healthy. So this thing gets a pot all by itself, and hopefully it'll become huge one day. And I'm going to dig out the second little seedling that was right next to it of the same species. And this thing will go into a backup pot. So this too has a very healthy looking root system. I didn't break anything. It has a tap root. It has a lot of nice lateral root development and branch offs. So those are all very good signs. The second survivor goes with jackfruit backups. Of course, I'm not going to have 5 of these potentially giant jackfruit plants in one pot. So I kept 2 in another pot, the pot that everything was in originally, and filled it up with more of this really sandy loam, 90+% sand. And this one gets buried up to the neck in a very, very loosely placed sandy loam. So on day 78, 10 days after the Caribbean red papaya seeds were sowed indoors, I saw this. So that suggests that something went awry during my first original germination. Indoor temperatures range from 75 to 85 Fahrenheit, and that's a decently warm. You don't want it to be significantly over 30 Celsius because I don't think a lot of plant root systems will like that. And on day 79, you can see this backup is doing okay. And the main plant is looking a little bit crooked. It's got its own pot, and you got to rotate all of your potted plants pretty much like twice a week, every 3 or 4 days, because with phototropism, they're just going to be all crooked, even if they are meant to grow straight up and tree-like. So a few days later, you can see there's been yet more development. There's more leaves, and the leaf morphology is changing. This backup is coming along slower. It makes sense because it got a slower start. So this is the first fertilization that I'm doing only for this second seedling, the first survivor that gets its own pot. It's 1 small scoop of Miracle Gro plus a pinch of crushed vitamin powder. So the vitamin powder isn't to provide for vitamins, but rather magnesium and calcium in abundance. And it's got many other things as well. There's a lot of overlap between that and Miracle Gro. So on day 83 or day 15 of this Caribbean red papaya series, you get our first germination. So that suggests that you can germinate papaya seeds indoors in just 15 days, and therefore it's reasonable to subtract that from the 43 days it took for me to get germination in this series. So it took an extra 28 days for reasons unknown, and generally I would say, based on my experience here, that papaya seeds just do this. They tend to go sort of dormant and pop up later, even when you're not watering the pot and not expecting anything and just expected a total loss. So you're going to get more seedlings than you thought you were, but they're all going to come later. And you can see, perhaps due to the very humid nature of this environment that I've provided, there's a root that's erroneously growing on the surface. Maybe it just wants the air out more, actually, and maybe it's too wet in there. So on day 88, it became pretty obvious by now that these are papaya seedlings, not black mission fig. So that debate was pretty much settled in my head. This is the backup, and the one that gets pot all by itself. It gets a lot more sun, and one leaf is super glossy, as if it's been dipped in epoxy or wax or something else that makes it all look plastic and shiny. So I'm really excited as to what the purpose of that is, and what that's going to change into. So on day 96, you can see the jackfruit seedlings are huge. They're going to overshadow these very slow growing papayas very easily in just a month or two. So this backup seedling is actually doing pretty well. That major leaf on the top, one of the true leaves, that has the form of a papaya leaf. And this main one that I have in a pot by itself, it sort of has the same morphology, but the leaves actually aren't as big. I think, based on my experience, that plants that grow in the shade and don't get much direct sunlight tend to compensate by getting darker, bigger leaves, which is very beautiful and all, but eventually when they do get exposed to more sunlight, they can burn, as I've seen in some of my plants after this balcony started to get direct sunlight in late August and beyond. So I'm currently fertilizing my plants once like this every 2 weeks, and I just flood just to provide for enough water, like 2/3 of a gallon, to dissolve that powder. You don't want it to be too concentrated into the soil. And for this pot, this thing gets no fertilizer for comparison. It's just a backup, and the soil's only half full. So this thing has no drainage either, and I basically can't overwater too much, because then the bottom would be all flooded. And perhaps that could mimic some conditions such as groundwater that tap roots that go very deep can tap into, but in this case it's very shallow. So yeah, I'd better watch it. With this pot, I don't want to overwater. And the leaves here are getting pretty big actually for this backup. It's really coming onto its own. So on day 102, even if I subtract 28 days from this timeline, that's still, what, 74 days. This is a very slow growing plant. It's maybe between 2 to 3 inches high. Not even 3 inches, I would say. And the leaves are developing that characteristic morphology here. But if you look over here, you can see that the backup actually has bigger leaves. So I'm thinking that's because it grew up in shade. I'm really interested to see how this comparison plays out. It's in the corner. It's probably more aerated due to the early weeks in which you're sort of on a mini hill that I created with gullies flanking it. So the aeration of oxygen to the roots was excellent, no doubt. But I think in the long run, this main plant will far surpass that one because it's got complete nutrition, it's got more sunlight, and it's got more space to itself. But you never know. It's not a perfect comparison because that other plant was only potted in a pot that was meant to store a bunch of backups that I'm eventually going to throw away because I don't have room for 3 giant extra jackfruit seedlings. And I'm showing the drainage here because a lot of people actually who join in at later dates, they think that I'm just flooding the pots and leaving it there, but actually that's not true. The water always drains out within a few minutes. One of the jackfruit seedlings in the foreground already has a burned leaf. It has these white patches that doesn't look like any kind of leaf burn or fertilizer burn I've ever seen. I think that's due to nutrient deficiencies already after just 2 months. So I'm wondering if this backup papaya seedling will suffer the same fate. Stay tuned to my YouTube channel for further updates to find out. Thanks for watching.